So this is our first lecture of the semester. This is Chapter 1, Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology in the Martini text. And that's basically what we're going to do. We'll hit parts of the chapter, probably won't hit every single thing, but want to take a look at some basic concepts and sort of how this class is going to run for the semester. So the first thing to really understand about studying the human body is that, you know, we can classify these things based on different structures or different levels of classification, and we'll look at that really throughout the semester from different classification levels as we study these different components. But one of the primary sort of physiological concepts that we're going to be talking about and coming back to throughout the semester is what's known as homeostasis. And homeostasis is really the body's goal throughout our lives, and that is to achieve sort of balance, or achieve keep body systems within a certain range. And that's essential to survival because the environment that we live in our body is always changing and adapting to what's happening. So those are things that we'll look at sort of as we go throughout the semester. And so, as you know, this class is called Anatomy and Physiology. And so anatomy, what does that mean exactly? What is anatomy? What is physiology? Well, anatomy is, as you probably know, the actual study of the actual structures of the body, right? Just saying, for instance, if we're talking about muscle, you're identifying the bicep and the tricep and the sternocleidomastoid and the gastrocnemius and all these different muscles and identifying them. But you're not really concerned about how that muscle works or what it does or how it contracts. You're just more concerned with identifying that structure. And that's what anatomy is. And that's primarily what we'll do in the lab. Lab is the anatomy portion of this class. In lecture, we focus more on the physiology of things, which is the study of the function. So again, if you're talking about that muscle that I just talked about, you're not concerned as much that it's a bicep or a tricep or, you know, where it's located, that structure. But really what you're more concerned about is how does it work, right? What is the function of that muscle? How does it contract? What is the role of actin and myosin and calcium and adenosine triphosphate, and how do these myosin heads pivot and so forth and so on, all these things that we're going to be talking about as we go throughout the semester in lecture. So as you can see, you really are dealing with the same topic, muscle, but you could study it in a different way, and that's really what this class is, anatomy and physiology. And studying the function in physiology, we'll use chemistry and genetics and biology and all other components to really sort of get a full understanding of how these structures actually work. All right, so anatomy, again, describes the structures of the body, what they're made of, where their location, you know, where they're located, what their, you know, any structures that are associated with them. And the physiology, then, is the study of the functions of these anatomical structures, right? How do they work? And so that'll, like I said, lab, anatomy, lecture, physiology. So anatomy, we can look at things in what's called gross anatomy or macroscopic anatomy, which is basically examining things that are easily seen with the naked eye. You don't need a microscope or something else. You can just look at it and say, okay, that's what this structure is. So we'll be doing that throughout the semester. Most of what we'll look at is gross anatomy, so like surface anatomy, the actual features of a given structure, systemic anatomy, clinical anatomy, all different sorts of anatomy, the ways of viewing things from a gross anatomy standpoint. We can also look at things, and this will be our first lab session that we'll do, under what's called microscopic anatomy. Microscopic anatomy either studies cells or molecules or tissues in terms of what they look like. And so, for instance, the first thing we'll look at in lab is the histology, which is the study of tissues, right? So we're looking at, for instance, stratified squamous epithelium and other connective tissues and muscle tissue, but we're looking at them under the microscope, things you can't see with the naked eye that you need magnification for. And so we'll do that in our first lab unit. We'll do some in A&P2 as well. All right. So that's anatomy. How will we study physiology? Well, we'll look at it in many different ways. We'll look at it if we look at just cells in terms of how they work, cell physiology, organ physiology. We'll be looking at a lot of organs in terms of how those specific organs work. maybe systemic physiology or pathological physiology. We do a lot of looking at diseases and how diseases, how they respond and how they work, what is the mechanism behind a lot of these diseases, something that we'll look at. So that is anatomy and physiology. Now, as I said at the outset, we'll be looking at these components and body structures from many different levels, from a very basic or chemical, molecular level to a very high, full, most complex organism level, and many levels in between. And so to really understand how we'll do that, we want to appreciate these different levels of organization. Okay? And so you're going from the most basic level, as I said, which is like a molecular level or simplest level, all the way up to cells, tissues, organs, organ systems, and then organism, the whole human body, is the most complex level. Okay? So we want to look at these and get a feel for what each of these levels consists of. So the first, as I said before, is the chemical or molecular level, and this is the most basic level. And atoms are the smallest chemical units in the body, and these chemical units are combined to form molecules, and molecules combine to form cells, and that's how it builds, right? You start from a basic level and you keep combining things, and things get more complex. So we won't spend a whole lot of time at the chemical or molecular level, but that will lead into what's known as the cellular level, which, as I said, are groups of atoms and molecules and organelles working together. Cells combine to form tissues, and it gives you the tissue level. Tissue is a group of similar cells working together, and that's where we'll begin our study, is in the histology chapter and in lecture and lab, looking at these groups of cells. Okay? Tissues then combine to form organs. Organs like the heart or the lung or the stomach or liver or any organ in the body are basically made up of a group of tissues together. Organ systems is a group of organs working together. There are 11 organ systems, and as I said before, that's how this course is really divided up based on organ systems. We essentially do half of the organ systems in AMP1, half of the organ systems in AMP2, and then finally the organism is the whole thing together. All these organ systems combine together to form the organism. And so if you look at this from a visual standpoint, right, you have chemicals, atoms combine to form molecules, giving the chemical level. The chemicals then combine to form cells, right? So chemicals can combine, and you take lots of chemicals and put them together. That's going to give you one cell. So, for instance, one heart muscle cell, right? That would be the cellular level. And we'll look at things from the cellular level, not extensively, but to get an idea of how these things work, we'll look at cells. As I said, you take a lot of heart muscle cells, combine them together, maybe with some adipose tissue and some other things. That's going to give you a tissue, right? Tissue level. Tissues combine to form organs. If you take all the organs in that given system, like the cardiovascular system, for instance, that gives you the organ system level, right? And then all organ systems together give you the full organism. So you see, we can look at things based on their level of organization and how we'll go about studying them. All right. So organ systems are really important, right? There are 11 organ systems, and again, that's how this course is basically set up and organized. Okay. We have the integument, skeletal, muscular, nervous, endocrine, cardiovascular, lymphatic, respiratory, digestive, urinary, and reproductive system. Those are the 11 organ systems in the body. All those organ systems combine and work together to form the organism. So I briefly want to run through each of these organ systems so you have just sort of a working knowledge of the organs and the organ systems and sort of what they do. Okay? So the first organ system that we'll look at is the integument. And the integument primarily consists of your skin. This will be our first organ system that we'll study after we do the histology chapter. Includes the skin, but also the hair and sweat glands and nails, and functions of this integumentary system. There are many functions, but some of the primary ones are things like protecting against the environment. So like our skin, right? Our outer surface of our skin is essentially designed to protect us from, environmental pathogens and hazards that could potentially enter our body. Also can help regulate body temperature, provide sensory information. So this is the integument. This is our first organ system. Next one we'll look at after the integument is the skeletal system. As you guys know, skeletal system primarily is bones. That's what we'll be looking at. But there are some ligaments and cartilage components that we'll also study with that. But primarily our focus will be on bones. And these bones are designed to provide support and protection, right? Think about, the bone, your skeleton, just sort of being like the framework for the entire body. Think about your skull or your sternum and ribs and how they help protect delicate organs beneath that. So really important in terms of providing support and protection, but also is a great reservoir of calcium and other minerals. There's bone marrow that helps form blood cells. We'll talk more about blood in A&P2. But you can see there's quite a bit of function associated with the skeletal system. After the skeletal system, we'll do the muscular system, right? And there are three types of muscle, skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle. So we'll look at all of those, but we'll focus primarily on skeletal muscles, right? And skeletal muscle primarily provides movement, can provide protection and support, also can store sugar, for instance, can generate heat whenever the muscle contracts. So it has a lot of functionality as well, obviously. So after the skeletal system, we'll be looking at the nervous system, which, as you guys know, the primary organs are the brain and the spinal cord, but also peripheral nerves and sensory organs that we'll look at, like the eye and the ear, get a feel for how those guys work. And the functions of the nervous system is really to direct immediate response to a given stimuli, right? So, for instance, pulling your hand away from a hot stove or reacting to something. Those are impulses that are direct and quick that are driven by the nervous system. Okay? Provides sensory information about what's going on, coordinates activities. So we'll look at a lot of those functions when we do the nervous system. And then the final organ system for this A&P1 class will be the endocrine system. When you think of endocrine system, you should think of hormones, right? Hormones that are secreted from these organs. Organs like the pituitary gland or the pancreas, the male and female gonads, the thyroid gland, the adrenal glands. All of these components. The pituitary gland is up in the brain, up here. The pancreas is right here in the sort of back wall near the stomach. The gonads are obviously in the groin region in the reproductive area. The thyroid gland is just below your Adam's apple, and the adrenals sit right on top of the kidneys. So anyway, a lot of these endocrine organs secrete hormones, and hormones are messages sent to other parts of the body that direct sort of long-term changes and activities of other organ systems. They alter metabolic activity of a given target, and so we'll look at those, all of those endocrine organs and the hormones they secrete and sort of how they work as our last organ system for A&P1. When A&P2 begins, we'll start with the cardiovascular system. Cardiovascular system has three essential major organs: the heart, which is a pump that essentially pumps blood throughout the system, and then blood vessels, obviously, the sort of pathway or the route that these blood can travel throughout the body. And so the primary function is essentially to deliver nutrients and oxygen to all the organs throughout our body so they can survive and thrive. So we'll look at how those components all play together, and that'll be our first organ system in A&P2. After that, we'll do the lymphatic system, which is our defense, right? How are we able to defend ourselves? Our body defends ourselves against infection and disease. We'll be looking at the spleen, for instance, and the lymph nodes and the thymus. Spleen is right over here. Lymphatic vessels are all these guys in green, and lymph nodes are where they sort of come to a point. This is the thymus right here, which is responsible for T-cell formation. You may have heard of those. They're a certain class of lymphocytes that helps defend our body against pathogens. All right, so we'll look at that. After lymphatic, we do respiration, which is, again, how we acquire oxygen, essentially, from the atmosphere and deliver it to our bloodstream so that our body can receive oxygen and everything can survive. Oxygen, respiration, major organs, things like the nasal cavity, the trachea, right? It's this long windpipe, essentially, that goes into our lungs. And then the gases exchanged at the alveoli, which are the smallest components, essentially, where gas exchange occurs, so it can go into our bloodstream. And CO2 can be delivered the other way and expelled out. So that's respiration. After that, we'll do digestion. Digestion has a lot of players in terms of major organs. You have the oral cavity, essentially, with the teeth and tongue and pharynx. After that, you have the esophagus, which is basically a long tube, muscular tube, that transmits the material from our oral cavity down into our stomach. Right? Stomach is, you guys all know what the stomach looks like. The stomach is materials are broken down a little bit further and transferred into the small intestine, then to the large intestine. You also have some accessory components like the liver and the gallbladder and the pancreas that help with digestion as well. And so obviously the function here is to process and digest food, absorb nutrients, store energy reserves, things like that. All right. So again, you just want to have sort of a working knowledge of these different organs and organ systems. And you'll need this for lab as well, so it's good to have a general understanding of all these organs and their organ systems and the organs that are associated with them. After that, we'll do the urinary, which is your kidneys primarily. That's function is to excrete waste products in the blood via the formation of urine, travels down the ureter into the urinary bladder, where it's temporarily stored and then released through the urethra. And so that's how our body gets rid of waste products, but also helps regulate ion concentration and pH, keep things in balance, help achieve homeostasis in our blood. Is very important from that standpoint. So that's the urinary system. And then we have the male and female reproductive system. Function is producing male sex cells like sperm, for instance, and those components. Female reproductive system along the same line. We'll look at those different reproductive systems in ANP2, and then ultimately look at, once these two sperm and oocytes come together in fusion of the gamete, and how that proceeds from that standpoint. So those are all of the organ systems that we want to look at throughout the semester here in ANP1 and ANP2. All right, so on to our first sort of truly physiologic topic, and that is what's known as homeostasis. And homeostasis, as I said before, is a really important concept that we're going to come back to time and again throughout the semester, and it's really your body's goal throughout your life, and that is to achieve a stable internal environment. So all of our organ systems and body systems work together to achieve this. And again, we're not always in the same environment. For instance, sometimes it's hot, sometimes it's cold, sometimes we're more active, sometimes we're less active, sometimes we're digesting food, other times we're storing materials. So your body is always adapting to what's going on internally and externally. And so within that, your body wants to stay within a normal range, like, for instance, body temperature and the amount of fluid we have. And the body needs to do this in order to survive. Survival is dependent on achieving homeostasis. If you do not, if your body cannot achieve homeostasis, that is essentially a disease state. So, for instance, blood pressure. You guys probably all know blood pressure. Normal blood pressure is 120/80, right? And so your body wants to always be at least in that range for the most part. Maybe a little bit lower probably would be the best, but somewhere around there. If it's chronically long-term elevated, right, if it's above 120 over 80, like 140 over 90 or 150 over 90, even when you're just not doing anything all the time, that's not a good thing, right? That's hypertension. That high blood pressure can cause a lot of problems. And so that's a great example of if homeostasis is not achieved, that is a disease state. Okay, and so that's really what your body is trying to do, and we'll talk a lot about homeostasis. And so we want to look at how does your body achieve homeostasis? What are the mechanisms behind achievement of homeostasis? And so you have different mechanisms like autoregulation and extrinsic regulation. What we want to look at is how this is done, right, in terms of how the adjustment of these physiological systems is coordinated to achieve and preserve homeostasis. And there are three parts, three players, if you will, involved in this process: receptor, control center, and effector. Receptor, as the term indicates, receives the stimulus. This is what your body discovers that something is not happening or is out of range, some sort of stimulus that's telling it that it's out of range. That information is sent to the control center, which is primarily typically your brain, although not always. It may be in the organ that is responsible for that may respond differently. But the control center typically processes the signal and sends the instructions out to the effector, which is what carries out the instructions to achieve, bring things back into range. Okay, so receptor, control center, and effector is really important players involved in that process. Okay, now those are the players that are involved in achieving homeostasis. But there are two ways that it's achieved, and it's known as negative or positive feedback. Okay, and the primary way that the body achieves homeostasis is through what's called negative feedback. There are a few examples of positive feedback, but most we want to focus on is negative feedback. And negative feedback is a corrective mechanism, essentially, that opposes or negates this change or this deviation or this variation from normal range, right? So like the blood pressure example I was giving you. Blood pressure goes up, but you want it to come back down in range. So the body has a system primarily to slow heart rate if needed, as well as to dilate blood vessels to get blood pressure back to closer to that 120 over 80, right? So how does the body bring things back into homeostasis, right? And so that when it does that, it negates this change from normal limits, and normal range is achieved. And so most homeostatic regulation involves negative feedback. And so we'll look at a couple of examples of how that works. One is what's called thermoregulation. Thermoregulation is just maintaining a consistent temperature, right? You guys all know normal body temperature, 98.6, right? You're growing up, your mom would take your temperature, and if you had a fever, you knew it was like 100 or 101 or even 99, right? That's high. That's out of range, right? And so we want to look at this process of thermoregulation. How does your body maintain homeostasis from a thermoregulatory standpoint? And before we talk how the body does it, we can use an example of how your body temperature, how your temperature is regulated at your home, right? And so this hopefully will help you see the correlations of how your body does it. So again, as you can see, there's a receptor, control center, and effector, and the goal is to achieve homeostasis, right? So homeostasis is normal room temperature, right? So whatever you set your thermostat at, right? So let's say you set it at 72 degrees. I don't know. Everyone has a different temperature they like to set it at, but let's just say you set it at 72 degrees, right? And that's normal room temperature. That is homeostasis, okay? Let's say it's a really hot summer day, right? It's really going to be a hot day outside, and obviously this normal room temperature of 72 degrees is not going to stay that, right? If it's 100 degrees outside, it's not going to stay 72 degrees inside your house without some sort of intervention. And so temperature rises, right, outside, and so the temperature of normal room temperature, 72, also starts to go up, right? And so there's a receptor that receives that information, a thermometer, that tells that, okay, it's not 72 degrees anymore, right? That thermometer can read that and sends that information to the control center, which is your thermostat, right? That's where you have it set at 72 degrees. And so once it goes out of that range, the control center receives this information. The control center then sends the commands to the effector. Right? The effector in this case would be the air conditioning unit. Right? The air conditioning unit then will be instructed to turn on. The air conditioner turns on, pumps cool air into the house, and the normal condition is restored. So can you see how that is a negative feedback loop? The temperature was going up from 72 to say 73 or 74 or 75, whatever it was going up to, and the air conditioner, the effector, essentially negated that change and brought it back into homeostasis by pumping cool air into the house. All right, so it's a great example of thermoregulation, how it happens at our house. Okay, our body works in a relatively similar fashion. Right, it's a nice correlation. Right, think homeostasis, normal body temperature. As I said, normal body temperature is typically 98.6. Let's say. Right, you guys all know that. Well, let's say it's that hot day that I was just describing before, and you know, it's 11 o'clock in the morning and it's already 90 degrees outside, it's really humid, and you decide you want to go outside and get some exercise. And so your normal body temperature is 98.6. If you go outside and you start exercising, your muscles are contracting, producing heat, and you have the ambient temperature that's going up, your 98.6 is not going to stay the same, right? It's going to start to go up. You have more temperature factors driving core temperature up, and so normal body temperature is disturbed. And so you have receptors, like temperature sensors in the skin and the hypothalamus, that acquire this information that temperature in your body is not staying the same. And so it sends information to the thermoregulatory center of the brain, which happens to be in your hypothalamus, and it will gather this information in the control center. The control center in the brain then will send commands to effectors to try to cool yourself down. And so what could the body do? Well, one thing, it can start sweat glands to be more active, right? Sweat glands, as you guys know, produce water, right? And water is produced, it's released onto the skin surface. Why is this effective means of releasing heat? Well, heat travels very well with water. So when you lose water onto the skin surface, heat is going to conduct well with that out onto the body surface, helping you achieve more of a normal body temperature on the inside. It also may dilate blood vessels on the skin surface, which may also help, radiate heat off of your body and allow for your body to then achieve homeostasis, right? But it's the same thing. It's a negative feedback. You've negated this change or deviation from normal range and got it back into homeostasis. All right? So that's a great example of negative feedback. Another great example of negative feedback would be like, say, for instance, blood sugar regulation, right? You guys may or may not be familiar with how your blood sugar is regulated, but I think you guys all know probably that, your blood sugar is not always the same, right? If you wake up in the morning and you're able to measure your blood sugar before you had breakfast, right? It has a very easy way now if there's so many glucometers. You get a little prick of blood, put it on a strip, put it in the machine, and it gives you your blood sugar, right? So you measure your blood sugar before you have breakfast in the morning. It's probably going to be fairly low, right? You probably haven't eaten anything overnight. Hopefully your blood sugar is a little bit low anyway, on the low side of normal. And then when you eat something, you ingest something, right? What's going to happen to your blood sugar? Well, as you ingest and digest all the food that you've eaten, if it has sugar in it, sugar is going to be transported into your bloodstream, and your blood sugar is going up, right? It's going out of normal range, okay? And so how does the body get the blood sugar back down? How does it achieve homeostasis by negating this change in blood sugar? Well, you may or may not know that your body has this organ called the pancreas that produces insulin. Insulin is released, and again, in a normal, healthy individual, when blood sugar goes up, the pancreas releases insulin in response to this elevation in blood sugar. Insulin travels to the bloodstream and basically goes to locations like skeletal muscle and the liver and instructs those organs to pull the sugar into their cells, thereby getting it out of the blood, right? And so the sugar then goes into the muscle where it can be stored or it can be used, and your blood sugar comes back down, right? And so that's another great example of negative feedback, right? Your body has negated this change in blood sugar. And if your body cannot do that, right, chronically elevated levels of blood sugar, you guys probably know, diabetes, right? And that's a disease state. So you can see it's very important for the body to be able to achieve homeostasis, all right? All right, so those are a couple of nice examples of negative feedback. You have thermoregulation we talked about, and then I just talked a little bit about blood sugar. Now, what about positive feedback? Positive feedback is a different mechanism. This is, again, helping your body achieve homeostasis, but it works in a much different manner, right? It's less common than negative feedback, but it produces a response that exaggerates or enhances the effect of what's going on. And you might think, well, that doesn't make sense. Why would you want to enhance something? How are you going to pull that? How is that going to achieve homeostasis? But I think if you look at a few examples here, I think that'll help you understand what we're talking about and how it works. Okay, so two really good examples of this are blood clotting and labor and delivery. Actually, are good examples of positive feedback loop that ultimately help the body achieve homeostasis. So the first one I want to talk about is blood clotting, right? And blood clotting is, you know, what happens, hopefully, if you have platelets in your blood and you're not taking like a blood thinner or something like that, that if you have a damage to a vessel and you're bleeding, you want that wall, the damage in that wall, to be patched, essentially, and to not bleed, right? And so how does that happen? Well, when you have an initial damage of a vessel of some kind, right, it's going to bleed. And when bleeding occurs, we're going to see chemicals that are released, and chemicals basically start a chain reaction in which like cell fragments and platelets and things like that start to form a clot, right? But you guys know that we've all had a cut of some kind before, where, you know, maybe on the first day after the cut, it's kind of, you know, stopped bleeding, but maybe it hasn't fully sealed off, right? It may be oozing a little bit or not completely enhanced. And so that's what you want to happen with a clot, right? Think about what happens when you first get a cut to like maybe a week later, right? You get a really thick scab that ultimately forms. And so that clotting process, that mechanism of enhancing that clot from a very small just patch initially to a full-on scab, right? That has to go through an acceleration process. It has to go through a positive feedback loop. So essentially that clotting process, again, in a normal situation, chemicals are released that enhance it and make that clotting stronger and stronger and stronger to accelerate that process. And so we call that a positive feedback loop. And the clot gets stronger and stronger and thicker, and ultimately completely stops that healing, and you have a really nice, thick, strong scab, which ultimately will be undermined and replaced by epithelial tissue and scar tissue, and then you're hopefully functionally back in business. But you can see the actual mechanism of the clot process is a positive feedback loop. Another really good example of this is labor and delivery. Okay? Again, you may have, I mentioned this previously, and you, again, may not quite see the connection off the top of your head, how labor and delivery is an example of a positive feedback mechanism. Sorry about that writing, it's the best I can do. But think about what happens to a woman when she's pregnant, right? She has this initially at fertilization. After fertilization occurs, you have this, you know, embryo essentially that's implanting on the uterus wall, and the uterine wall begins to, just like the embryo does, enlarge. It gets bigger and bigger, and the uterus gets larger and larger, and then hopefully you get to the point of 9 months gestation, and the uterus is probably something on the order of 40 times bigger than it was before pregnancy. And so what happens? Well, the uterus starts to contract, right? It's made of smooth muscle, and the contractions, with the help of hormones and a synchronized hormonal system from the female, we start to see contractions occur. Now, what happens to those contractions? And again, even if you've never experienced this personally or even seen something, you've probably heard people say it on TV, they always ask questions about the contractions of the female. how far apart are the contractions, right? And so that's what happens to these contractions. They start to get more and more intense and stronger and closer together, right? That's a positive feedback loop. You're enhancing the effect of the contractions so that ultimately delivery can occur and the uterus will start to work back to its normal size, which is more homeostasis level. All right? So that's another good example of positive feedback. So, that's how homeostasis is achieved, either through negative feedback or positive feedback. We're talking about a couple of examples of each. And again, that's the body's goal, right, is to work together to maintain homeostasis, and it's a state of equilibrium, right? Continually adapting, dynamic equilibrium. And all these physiological systems work together to achieve this balance, and failure to do so will result in potentially disease if it's not curtailed, and then maybe even death if it's not treated and taken care of. So really important concept of homeostasis in terms of how it helps the body survive. All right. So, and then here's a nice summary slide of some of these, other processes and you can review in terms of homeostatic regulation. All right, the last thing we want to look at here in lecture primarily are getting a feel for anatomic terminology, as well as talk a little bit about the body cavities and how those are organized. Okay, so anatomical terminology, as we'll talk a little bit about in the lab, as you have a lot of terms to learn in lab, are essentially, it's kind of like learning a new vocabulary, right? There are things you can describe the body, but you may not know the exact anatomical term for that. And so that's what we want to start to learn, is how we can describe the body surface. Instead of saying, the front of the stomach, you'll say the anterior abdomen, or the front of the elbow, you'll say the antecubital region, or so forth and so on. Instead of saying lower back, you're going to say the lumbar region, right? So terms you want to become familiar with in this beginning this class, because you're going to be coming back to them throughout the semester and in your future studies in either nursing or PT or OT or whatever pathway you're headed down. So it's good to get a nice background and understanding of a lot of these terms going forward. So superficial anatomy is just basically locating structures on the body surface and identifying them, right? And so there are different anatomical landmarks that you want to look at, and this is where a lot of these terms will come in, right? So again, where the neck is on a body, but the term for that you want to use now is the cervical region. You know where the cheek is, but instead of that, you want to call it the buccal region. Or, the head, right, is the cephalic region. The armpit is the axillary region. As I said, the front of the elbow, the antecubital region, right? So you just want to be able to understand all these terms. And as I said, there are a lot of these terms are in the lab manual that you're going to be identifying. Okay, so these are nice images to sort of run through to make sure you understand all the different anatomical terms. Okay, posterior view as well. Now there are also different quadrants and regions which you can subdivide the abdominal and pelvic cavities, but we'll talk more about that in lab. All right. Now, what about directional terminology? Directional terminology is a really important concept when you're speaking about how something is moving on the body or what direction it's moving. You want to become familiar with these terms. And most people probably know, like for instance, anterior and posterior, right? Anterior is the front, posterior is the back. May not be as familiar, for instance, with medial and lateral, so make sure you understand that medial is movement towards the midline of the body, right? There's the midline, and lateral is movement away from the midline of the body. Proximal and distal is another one you want to be able to practice and understand. Proximal is moving toward the attached base. Distal is moving away from the attached base. Okay, so you want to become familiar with those and have a good understanding of how those terms work as well. All right, now sectional anatomy is also very important, especially for those who might be going into looking at MRIs or sonography or any of those types of things, PET CTs. you want to be able to understand these different planes and sections, right? And so we can divide the body up in these different sections in order to properly visualize and understand these structures. Okay? And so there are basically three planes or sections you want to understand. You have a frontal plane, you have a sagittal plane, and you have a transverse or horizontal plane. Right? Frontal plane basically divides the body into anterior and posterior. Right? The sagittal plane cuts the body down the middle and divides it into left and right, and the transverse plane cuts the body into top and bottom, or superior and inferior parts. And anywhere along those planes you can assess and study, but those are the three planes you want to look at. And again, those are to be seen in the lab as well. Now, body cavities are the last thing we want to look at here. Body cavities also are really important because these body cavities protect organs and permit changes in size and shape. And primarily there's a dorsal and a ventral body cavity. The dorsal body cavity includes your skull and your spinal cord cavity that houses those organs, and then your ventral body cavity can be divided into thoracic component and the abdominal pelvic cavity that are divided by the diaphragm, which is right here. Right? And so we want to look at those and make sure you have a familiarity and understanding of how those work. Now, basically, in the ventral body cavities have what are called serous membranes. And serous membranes are very thin, simple squamous epithelium, which you're going to learn about in histology chapter, that line not only the body cavity, but that covers the actual organ as well. Right? And so you have what is called a parietal and a visceral layer. The parietal layer covers the cavity, and the visceral layer covers the organ. So it's like a double-layered membrane that we see in all of these body cavities. And so a really good example of that is what you see like in your chest wall, for instance. Right? Think about the heart. Right? The heart resides in what's called the pericardial cavity. And within that cavity, you have a lining. You have a lining that covers the heart. You have a lining that covers the actual cavity or pericardial cavity. Okay, and so again, the component that covers the heart, and you can look in this image, is the visceral pericardium. Right, it lines the heart, and then the parietal pericardium lines the cavity. Right, and it creates a little space, and that's called the pericardial cavity, and that's where the heart resides. So same concept for the lungs and the abdominal cavity, pelvic cavity, etc. Is you have these thin linings covering the cavity and also covering the organ itself. And so here's a nice shot of that in the thoracic cavity, and you can see the heart and the lungs and how there's a lining of each cavity, but also a lining of each organ. Beneath the diaphragm, you have what's called the abdominal pelvic cavity, and that basically has what's called the peritoneal cavity, right? You have a parietal peritoneum that lines the internal cavity or body wall, and then you have the visceral peritoneum that covers each of those organs, right? And so you can subdivide the abdominal pelvic cavity into the abdominal, which is the upper portion, and the pelvic, which is the lower portion. And within the abdominal cavity, you have what's called this retroperitoneal space, and this is an area posterior to the peritoneal cavity, right? And this is where we see like the pancreas and the kidneys, for instance. They're on that back wall. So when you look at the models, for instance, in lab, you're going to see these components on the back wall of the abdominal cavity. So you want to look at that in lab as well. And I'll go over that a little bit in lab when we meet at that time as well. And the pelvic cavity is just a lower portion, the same thing, but this has more of the reproductive organs and the ends of the urinary and digestive pathways. All right? So that's it for our first chapter. Again, sort of introduction, but again, work on your terminology, work on having a good understanding of homeostasis and different levels of organization, and that's it for this first chapter. So the next chapter we'll look at is the histology chapter, looking at tissues and how they're organized, and we'll also go over some of these topics in lab as well.